Okay, we're recording now. Oh yes, the other thing I forgot to say is if you can mute yourself when you're not speaking, just so we don't pick up any background noises. I say aware of the fact I've got roadworks going on outside. Okay. So, oh God. Like a live Q&A, like no swearing, no defamation. Let's keep this clean. Right, so welcome to the 2020 edition of Female Figures, which this year is themed around the topic of growing up. And this is a showcase that really showcases, spotlights the fantastic work being made by female animators and very exemplary on-screen representation within these films. So this is a selection of coming-of-age stories where we see growing self-awareness, identities forming, difficult choices being made, a selection of personal her stories, if you will. And I'm really delighted that I'm joined by three of the filmmakers and an academic to talk a little bit more about animation and the themes of the programme. I guess I should start by saying my name's Abigail and I'm a producer, programmer and director of Animate Projects. And I'm really delighted to be joined by Dr. Caroline Ruddell, who is a senior lecturer in film and divisional lead for production and performance at Brunel University, London. I also have with me Maryam Mohajer, a British-Iranian animation director who made the BAFTA-winning film Grandad Was a Romantic, which is in the programme. Linnéa Haviland, who is originally from Stockholm and is a visual artist, illustrator and art director for a sexual health service. And Linnéa made the collaborative piece A Different Category, which is in the programme, with three young curators that were at the Gerald Moore Gallery in South East London. And we're really pleased to have Camilla, who was one of these young curators, to join us, and she can talk a little bit more about that process. In fact, let's start with that now, really, to talk about A Different Category. I was really interested in including this film within the programme because, and to have you here as well, Camilla, to sort of have an authentic voice of a young person, a real kind of young woman's experience being voiced by young women, as patronising as that sounds from an older person perspective. But yeah, I'd be really interested to hear, because what I really love about this film is the way that it's a very naturalistic conversation. It doesn't have that kind of documentary feel to it. So I'd really be interested in how that process worked, how you kind of got that authenticity, Linnéa and Camilla, what it was like for you being part of that process.
So for me, I think when I applied for to be part of that, I really wanted it to be in collaboration with the young people. So I kind of, from the onset, didn't really have a very fixed idea of what I wanted the final outcome to be, or I had general themes. It was kind of based around a quotation I found when I did some research around kind of femininity and growing up. And I found this piece of research around how young middle-class white women in the US found that adolescence was a period marked by loss of voice. So that rang quite true for my experience, but this research was also a bit kind of the same generation as me, so growing up in the early 2000s. So I was kind of interested to see if that was still true, and if that was true for people who had a different kind of class or ethnic background than me. So if this was just something that's quite specific or more universal, and what other factors kind of influence how we experience femininity. So I tried to keep it really open and not be too leading with the conversations. But Camilla, you can see from your perspective how you found it.
Yeah, so the project started as we got put into groups, and we were working with these artists, and it just so happened that the group of the three of us we kind of had a similar lived experience, in that we were all a little bit lost in where we were, and we were 16, and we were just we were trying to kind of, actually watching it back now, it's a real snapshot of what it's like to be young and lost and kind of not know really who you are. And the three of us were all women of color, and we were all kind of in this really kind of white surroundings, and us trying to grapple with this overwhelming whiteness and its relationship to us and our voice was really interesting. and all of the conversations were just conversations that Linnéa recorded while we were making. So they're like completely earnest and completely genuine, and I listen back to my voice now and I'm like, I can't believe that was me. But yeah, I guess that's what makes it kind of really special, because they were like genuine conversations that we were having, and we were working through all of these ideas together, like really earnestly.
Yeah, and I suppose following on from that, the process, because you made the film collaboratively, so could you just talk a bit about how you work with sort of film and photography, yeah, as a collective? Maybe Linnéa, do you want to sort of start with that?
Yeah, so we had kind of set out workshops that were about, I think, 3 or 4 hours. And we kind of started off just like discussing. I recorded just some topics, and then we just experimented. Basically, like when I planned it out so that we could create the whole film together. So that the first was kind of creating, like, we took photographs on the first session, then I developed them at home in between, and then took them back, and then we did scratch animation on it. And then the final session was kind of like, I'd put everything together and I got everyone's feedback on it, and we animated like some of the transitions and things like that. So yeah, it was kind of really open, I guess. Like, I wanted the kind of visuals to naturally come out of the things we discussed. So it was mainly just like I had a fixed, what's it called, medium we would work in. So photography the first time, scratch animation the second time. We did some collaging as well. And then kind of it was just like free form, basically.
Mm-hmm. When I think back to it, I remember us getting the key into the drama department and finding all of these costumes and running around like the courtyard in like dresses and random outfits. And yeah, it was, I think the most interesting part of it was the fact that we were using pictures of us and then also found imagery, and kind of like really like all of the processes that Linnéa showed us, like, I think there was a mixture of things that were really new to us, like the scratch animation, and then like obviously like the film photography, which I don't think any of us had done before. And so it was collaborative in learning and making and talking, and also like using pictures of our own bodies, and the found imagery was really interesting, and like it really helped us understand, and like it progressed the conversations more, which then progressed kind of like the art more. And like, so it was like collaborative not only between us and Linnéa, but kind of every process really informed the other. Yeah,
and we kind of like what I like about it is we all worked on each other's work. You know, it wasn't like Camilla doing her photos and her scratch animation. It was like I would work on something that a photo Camilla had took, or vice versa. And so the final film is like almost each frame has some element of every one of us in it.
And how long was this process then of the workshops? Because you're sort of saying about this dialogue of going back and forth between the image and the sound. How long did you actually have to do this?
I think in total it was about 3 months. Yeah. So it's quite quick.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, Camilla, you just spoke about this, but I think one of the things that's a real, I think, noticeable concern in the programme is difference, and that feeling of, you know, feeling that society's telling you to look and act a certain way, and a feeling, you know, in a lot of the films that obviously you haven't all seen right now, but people will be seeing online later on. But this idea that, yeah, so that, you know, people are sort of fighting against what's expected of them, or kind of finding their way, yeah, through the world. And I just sort of wondered, maybe this is a sort of general question for everyone and whoever wants to take it first, but do you think, and I mean, do you feel like we're seeing more of this kind of representation in animation coming from female artists, female stories, you know, more about this kind of, I think, rebellion against the norm? Who wants to take that?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. I think I'll start by just picking up on what Linnéa and Camilla were saying about this sort of voice, which in your film is really explicitly dealt with, this idea of not having a voice growing up, as you know, having a particular identity. But I think that that kind of thing is implicit, if it's not explicit, in lots of work by female animators, which I think is why they turn to animation, which kind of brings me to your question, Abigail, because I think it's whether we're seeing more female animators doing that now is difficult to say, but I think it's always been there. And I think one of the reasons why women have turned to animation, I think there are a number of things, but one is that they have complete control over that process and what they want to say. So that lack of voice that may well have been apparent in their childhood and growing up can then be used in a way that they have complete and utter control over, with no one else telling them what to do, which of course you wouldn't get in a studio setting. So I think that's a really important part of why female animators have always used animation as a form of expression. But yeah, whether we're seeing more now is an interesting question. I don't know if anyone else has got any thoughts on that. Probably we are, because I think we've generally got more female animators sort of on the scene. But yeah, I'll hand it over to the actual animators.
I find it really hard to tell if it's more now or not, because I feel with a lot of things, when it comes to kind of progress or fighting against the norm, there's this overarching kind of way of telling the story where it seems like it's new and this is something that hasn't been said before, or this is like a way of looking at it that hasn't been done before. But then if you go back, actually it has been part of history for a really long time. It just hasn't been shown, or it's been buried in a way. So yeah, I'm not sure, but I'm like excited about that. There's definitely more opportunities now for female animators, and I think animation is kind of, like you said, Caroline, a really really amazing kind of tool to explore these issues, and it's very free in a way that other types of film aren't. I mean, something I think about a lot is like, how accessible is it, or what do you need to make this, you know, like with a different category, it was also a bit about what can we use that these like that us as collaborators can then take with us and use in everyday life. So it was very much kind of like I developed the film at home in my bathroom, and kind of seeing like, how can I use things that actually I don't need all of this really fancy equipment for it. And I think that's an amazing thing with animation, because you can literally just do it with paper and a pen, and it opens up a lot of possibilities that way.
I think that's a really good point, actually, that in our current context, there's so many more ways that we can get work out there and seen. So obviously festivals, but of course the internet, you know, it's so much easier for animators to get their work out there and for people to be able to access it, which has of course not always been that easy.
Maryam or Camilla, do you have anything else to say about, I don't know, proliferation of women's stories these days? Or you don't have to, of course, that's also an option.
I think I agree with Linnéa. It's not a new thing in animation. There has been a big wave of it in cinema, which is great, which is lovely. But in animation, I think because, especially 2D independent low budget animation, because you're doing your own thing, you don't think about filters, you don't think about, oh, okay, I need to do this way so that so-and-so approves. So it's been there, but as Caroline pointed out, it just hasn't been, no, sorry, Linnéa's, it hasn't been very much seen. But, you know, in festivals since, you know, many, many years ago, you would see these films. They wouldn't be very much seen outside the festival circuit.
Okay, I suppose moving on from that and kind of coming back to this talk about accessibility and craft. I mean, I'm always a big fan of craft, and I think that always sort of informs what films I select, what films I choose to watch. And, you know, in the programme I've got Petra Freeman's Tad's Nest, which is, you know, paint on glass, and there's a few different sort of stop motion, paper collage. Even Maryam, I mean, for me, your film has this incredible kind of textured aesthetic. And I'm really interested in what your feeling is about, I mean, other than, you know, there's an ease of just using whatever you can find, but is there something about craft that is more emotionally engaging? Or, you know, there always comes back to this thing about, you know, the feminine aesthetic of handcrafted animation. So I just wondered if you could talk to that a bit about your choices of craft and what you sort of see as craft and the feminine.
In my case, I have a painting background, and I quite love that background. And I think just a bit of texture, the handmade feeling of an image just brings that much more life to it. It's easier to connect with. It has a history now, you know, it's been touched by a human and it comes across when you see it. So I'm quite obsessed with that, actually. I emphasize on that in my film, to look messy and handmade. And yeah, I have actually said, oh no, that frame is too clean, I need to make it a bit more messy. And also it's layers and layers. I use so many, if I am using a digital software to put things together, I would go crazy with adding layers on top of each other just to get that feeling, you know, adding textures to it.
Sorry, Maryam, were you finished? I didn't want to interrupt you. Yeah, I think this is, it's one of the most fascinating questions about animation, and it's something that I spend a lot of my research time on, which is this sort of question of craft, and which I think gets bound up a lot with ideas about authenticity, which exactly ties in with what you're saying, Maryam, this idea that because something's been handled and touched and it's a real thing, whatever that means, it carries authenticity, and it certainly resonates with audiences. You know, they love, you know, everyone loves Wallace and Gromit and seeing thumbprints in the models and that kind of thing. And certainly I've got a colleague, Birgitta Hosea, who argues that her students are often very keen on using handmade processes when making, because of all those ideas around sort of authenticity and feeling like you're actually making something with your hands. But then I suppose that, you know, there's also the fact that animators, you know, I think every animator I know uses both processes, sort of handmade craft processes and digital. Some, of course, just use digital, but everyone I know that uses handmade processes also use digital processes as well. And there's also the question of where digital stuff tries to emulate craft-based handmade aesthetics, you know, something like Charlie and Lola, where it's digitally produced but it's made to look like it's collage and cut out. I think all these things raise some really, really good questions about what we perceive as authentic and how they're produced.
Yeah, for me, I think it's also kind of doing something collaboratively. It's like not really possible in the same way digitally. I mean, like we could sit with computers next to each other, but then we'd need lots of computers, and it's just something about being able to like scratch on something and then like give it to someone else. And I don't know, like you can kind of work on things together a lot more easily, I find. And also, yeah, exactly what you guys have said, like something about it, I don't know, the tactile nature for me feels more real and kind of have some sort of like emotional resonance that I feel is missing somehow in digital animation for me anyways. Like I don't have that same like emotional connection, I think, with the film.
I think as well, it's again that thing about the artist's voice is like you're more aware that this is being made by someone, and that, you know, it's like you're putting yourself into the film as well, like physically touching it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Camilla, do you want to say something as an artist? I mean, you know, you're obviously someone who works with art. I mean, has working with Linnéa changed your life? Has it made you interested in doing any animation again? Or, you know, sort of, can you talk a bit about what your practice is?
Yeah, so I don't know if I would be or have gone to study art if I hadn't done the film. Yeah, because I didn't really see it. It was like, you know, you do it at school, but like I didn't really see it as like something that I could use like as a career or like to express the ideas that I had beforehand, which wasn't just like drawing a nice vase, but like, you know, expressing yourself. The work that I do is mainly like ceramic based, but like to tell stories through ceramic, which I guess also has kind of a craft nature to it. And I guess that for me, the use of craft is really like loaded with a lot of whiteness, in that like I feel like things that are celebrated as craft are usually kind of valued more if they're made by kind of like white artists than kind of you know, non-white artists basically, and that's kind of like the ideas of labor are really interesting in that. I'm kind of going off topic here, but I guess in relation to the film, like our labor in that was so valuable, and because we were really expressing something with what we were making, and our voice was so important, that I guess that it couldn't have been in any other way apart from having it so handmade, because our voice and kind of like what we were doing, what we were trying to say was so important. And it was like a really interesting and fascinating tool in order to like explore like directly our labor as like women, young women of color, and finding our voice. So yeah.
Sure, Maryam, do you want to join in?
It's also simply, it's also, I look at it as kind of a treat, you know, like when we're kids, you know, drawing, painting, playing with plasticine, these are all fun things that we do, and it's really soothing to do. So it's kind of like a treat as well, like a therapeutic process to go through whilst making, you know, whilst creating something at the same time. There's so much in it. I don't know. It's very much rewarding, just actually to handle things and make things with your hands.
Sorry, I'm going to come in. Yeah, I think you both made some really, really important points. So Maryam, your point kind of, it makes you think about sort of animation as therapy, which is definitely a thing, because there are so many films that use animation to deal with trauma, and it's like a form of therapy, isn't it? So yeah, I completely agree. And also, Camilla, you raised a really good point about labour, and I think part of craft and why sort of some of the cultural value that we attach to craft is a lot to do with that labour, the fact that it takes so long to produce something that's handmade. That's definitely part of how we value it, I think.
That's interesting. You've sort of gone into another question that I was going to ask actually, which was about this process that the artists are going through in not only sort of reliving their own pasts, traumas, histories, but also like, I think that's quite interesting. Because obviously when you're looking back, there's an element maybe of nostalgia. You know, you're looking back as a different person, back at the person you were as a child. But do you think as well that, or you know, for your own experiences, are you making these films as well, not only for, you know, to kind of, I suppose, deal with, question something from your own past, your own feelings about your childhood, youth, but also is it about that sort of helping audiences as well? Are you thinking about what the audience is going to take from this, what kind of discussions they're going to have, how they might similarly reflect upon their own lives? What's the sort of intentions? Whoever wants to take that.
My last 4 films actually have been based on childhood memories. I try to be quite careful with it. If we're thinking, you know, if it's an issue that you want to sort out within yourself, you need to be very careful, because at the end of the day, the story has to work. You know, when it's something so close to your heart, it's so easy to get distracted and like go towards a kind of a self-indulgent and like try to justify things so much. So it is quite a challenge to keep a balance there, you know, to tell your story, tell a good story, whilst you're going over something quite, that has had quite a strong effect in your life. That's from the therapy, you know, when it's some issues that you're trying to work with. But once you do it, it is actually, it works. I experienced it firsthand with, years ago with the girl with short hair, you know, something that was, you know, a memory that was traumatizing me for years. Once I made the film and just almost accidentally changed the ending, I'm fine with it now. So that's a whole new universe to discover, I think. On the other hand, when you're basing your story on people that you know and like dearly love or not, again, that's a tricky one, because for the story to work, you might have to take your, you know, idol down from the pedestal that she or he has been all your life in order to make your story work. So it's quite an emotional roller coaster in many ways. And in my case, I think sharing the story with other people who don't know anything about it, you know, just in stages, just parts of it, helps a lot. To see, actually, yeah, I think I'm just bragging about, I don't know, my aunt here. I should not, you know, tone it down a bit. So yeah, it's very challenging, but if it works, it's quite nice when it's done.
I was when I made this film, I was more thinking about the process and what I wanted the process to be like for the girls I was working with. So I kind of like tried to, I didn't want it to be like I had this idea of what it would look like and I would like make these girls make it that way. I kind of wanted, like, what I wanted out of it was for them to feel like they had made something together with me and that they were also artists, part of making this artwork, so that like everyone's contribution was valued equally. And I think saying that, like, I do also think about what the audience will look like, in the sense that like I want it to look good. I want it to be like aesthetically pleasing, or I want to look at it and feel something. And by extension, I'm like thinking the artist or the audience will also feel something. But I am more kind of focused in my work on like having an outcome with the process, and then trying to trust that that will mean that the final project communicates something to an audience, or that they feel something when watching it. But that what makes them feel something is that the process was a certain way, and that the process was like valuable for the people that were involved.
I feel like the process was so like exactly like what Maryam was saying earlier, like therapeutic, and we got so much out of it that it was such a like specific experience to us. But because we were so specific with our own experience, I think that's what makes it like relatable, that we weren't just trying to broadly discuss like what it means to be an outsider, even though that's what ended up happening, because we were just so like personal and intimate with what we had gone through. I feel like that's what kind of made it more like people could connect with that more, rather than kind of in a broader setting. And like the feedback that I got from people was like, even people who like didn't have the same experience as us felt like, oh, I could really relate to that bit, and like this bit really spoke to me. And yeah, I feel like, yeah, that's what made it like so powerful, was how personal it was to us.
Caroline, did you want to add anything?
Only to say that I think there's kind of an element to a certain degree, and I completely agree with Maryam that we have to be careful about this stuff. But I'm speaking as a viewer, because I'm an academic rather than a maker. That certainly quite a lot of animation certainly comes across as a bit autobiographical, and I think we have to be a bit careful about that. I mean, sometimes animators write about it very specifically, and they've made a film in order, like I said before, to work through something that's happened to them. But it's still a mediated form. So even if someone's been very explicit about basing it on personal experience, it's still a mediation. So so I think there's definitely an element of the autobiographical, but just as Maryam says, we have to be careful about, taking things as fact.
And I just wanted to sort of follow up and just sort of ask Maryam a little bit more about Grandad Was a Romantic. Obviously, I know loads about it, but let's pretend I don't. Having seen it many times. But I'm really interested in the way that, you're dealing in your films often with, trauma, you're looking on childhood. I just love the way that you use humour as well. And could you just talk a little bit about the way that your sort of storytelling method, the way that because I mean, I don't want to give away for anyone who hasn't seen the punchline to Grandad Was a Romantic, but if you could just somehow talk about it without spoiling.
Without giving too much away, it's quite different with every film. Like with Red Dress No Straps, it took me a year first to finish the story, at least a whole year, and then the end. The film had a different ending until I was well in storyboarding stage, but I had a feeling the ending wasn't working. So, and it just came to me. I've said this before. We were coming back from a party with my partner in the car, and this is Red Dress No Straps, the film I made before Grandad. Just want to say how different it is. And I was crying in tears, and I said, I think I need to do this to the character, and that's going to be my ending. So there was that. But then with Grandad, it's a very short story. It's under 5 minutes, the whole film. But as soon as I wrote it, the ending was there. I knew this was going to happen. And I like being funny. I enjoy it, especially I've been living in the UK for 20 years, and I love the darkness of humor in the British culture. You could get away with saying something quite dark and awful and painful, but the humor just makes it okay and more approachable. And also I believe if you use humor, the audience will spend more time listening to you or watching you. Whereas if it's all, pain and sadness, it would be quite a challenge to keep people interested in listening to you all the way through. Grandad would not have worked without the humor. It would just be, and also with humor, it's the timing and unexpectedness of it. I love surprises. I love the stories that make me, oh, I didn't see that coming. I'm a big fan of humor, and I think it doesn't get much credit a lot of times, whereas it's quite difficult. I always think, making people laugh and making people scared is probably the most difficult things to do with your stories. And yes, it is based on my Grandad is there somewhere, but there so is another 2 or 3 different characters that I know of or I've heard of. That's another thing that I find helpful when you're basing your story on people you know. Again, if you stick to one person and say it as it was, it may not be as interesting. Whereas if you find a few different characters, as long as they work as one, and I like that bit of that, that characteristic of that person. And like in as I said, you know, in Grandad, there's at least 3 or 4 different characters in there. And I think that helps in him being more interesting.
I think, you know, I included that film and other films and, you know, this theme of growing up, because I think what is wonderful is when you're hearing a child sort of almost reciting like this family story. And then my granddad, you know, like the story she's heard a million times.
Yeah.
And then as it kind of gets more and more like you as an adult are watching it, go, oh, okay, she doesn't, you know, it's like you're seeing the reality of the less than perfect scenario. Yeah. And I think that I really love is that kind of the disconnect between the adult and the child. And when you start looking at the world through that child's eyes, and it's sort of that kind of fresh perspective you get, I think is wonderful and a perfect place for lots of humour.
I love working with kids. The process itself is fantastic because there's so much room for improvisation if you let them. But also there is this, you know, when a child tells you a story, there are no filters. You know, we've done it. We have said things, you know, we all remember that moment when we said this, but, you know, we just said it, and then you look at your mom and say, no, don't say that. So I love that. It, you know, she can say everything, and it's all in a matter of fact way. So in some ways, you're not directing your audience how to feel. You just say it as it was, and the audience is free to take it from there.
Okay, well, we're sort of out of time now, really, but if any of you have any sort of closing thoughts or anything else you'd like to share, please feel free.
I just wanted to say how much I enjoyed your films, so thank you very much.
Thank you for watching.
Well, that's been brilliant. Thanks so much for having this conversation. Yeah, and hopefully I'll see you all in real life at London Animation Festival sometime in the future, if not before. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.